this morning, and welcome to Kindle's webinar on visitor management, improving visitor experience, and can secure buildings become welcoming. Today we're going to talk about how security and vertical transportation can be incorporated into smart building technology to enhance visitor experience into your building. We'll discuss the public areas in the workspace, concentrating on reception areas, cafes and restaurants, and touch on topics such as net zero carbon, hybrid working, design team engagement, and client understanding. If you're not aware of Cundall, we're a team of multidisciplinary engineers originating from Newcastle in the UK in the late 70s, now with offices across the UK, internationally in Europe, MENA and the Asia Pacific area. We're around about 1,000 strong and do projects all over the world. Your speakers today are Rory Donoghue from our Smart Building team, Lee Harper from our security team, and myself, Graham Barker, who leads the Cundall Vertical Transportation or Lift and Escalator Consultancy. So to kick us off, I'd like to pass over to Rory, who's going to set the scene for today's webinar.
Thanks, Graham. In this webinar, we're going to explore why the ground floor of commercial buildings are changing. We'll also examine the systems involved in securing, supporting and transiting through these spaces, and how a new layer of sensing, analytics and interventions can deliver benefits that enhance the traditional building systems. Visitor management is a design facet common to many Cundall projects. From universities to museums, we focus on the safe, efficient and effective movement of people through private, shared and public spaces. As we think about a return to the office, to frame today's discussion, we will be considering the scenario of an inner-city, multi-tenanted commercial office building with publicly accessible cafe, restaurant, concessions and seating on the ground floor. Clearly, location of building, type of tenancy, the type of tenant and their risk profile, and the type of visitor expected all impact what can be provided on the ground floor of a building, though many of the problems and opportunities we face are common across all projects. So why are ground floor spaces changing? Planning requirements mean commercial buildings cannot ignore the community around them. They must provide some facilities, usually at the ground floor or near the top. Maximising net lettable internal area has always been a target for commercial property projects. Monetising all space within a building is in everyone's interest. Having a staff-only restaurant within a tenant demise makes achieving net zero carbon certification very difficult. Providing in-building shared catering facilities benefits all tenants and visitors without impacting their sustainability credentials. An added value for tenants. Smaller tenants need to be attracted to a building. As tenancies become more flexible, tenant attraction retention becomes even more critical. Developers and operators need to bring aesthetics, experience and relevant services that tenants will value and utilise, and that will anchor them to the building and consider other buildings by that same operator. So what is the impact of this change? Well, public realm within commercial buildings brings responsibilities for the developer and operator. With new demographics of people sharing these spaces, keeping them relevant is essential. When we consider new ways of working, everyone is a visitor to the building. Understanding their journeys and their experience entering the building and travelling through reception is how we can improve that experience. Spaces will become more complicated to plan and manage, to which we need to respond effectively. How will spaces be used? How are they being used? And ensuring they are being used safely is key to operators discharging their duty of care responsibilities. So let me hand over to Lee to take us through how security planning can respond to these changes.
Thanks for that, Rory. So if we take a look at our sort of typical layout that we've put together here, and the individual sort of spaces that we need to think about from a security perspective, along with the users that might use that space and how they'll navigate the building. This allows us to consider the operational requirements for a site, how it's going to operate, so that we can then think about what security considerations need to be made. So we'll start here with the public realm space. Now these obviously can be as large or as few as the space takes. They may consist of retail, leisure facilities, coffee shops, restaurants, bars, those kind of things. They could be accessed from street level and or from within the building from a centralised kind of lobby space as well. And the public realm kind of introduces people into the building that we can't train, we can't necessarily know what it is they're going to do. We introduce different flow rates into the building, different movement around, and it can then be difficult for security to know who's a genuine visitor and who isn't, and to protect that kind of barrier further into the secure space. We've then got our tenant demises, and these are the ones that are rented for people to work from. But again, these spaces might not just be office space. There could be, say, gyms, auditorium spaces, training facilities, etc. So our tenants may well be inviting visitors and members of the public into their space as part of their business needs as well. We also need to think about what other areas of the building tenants might need to access. And we've got our building management, or what we call back of house areas. And these will consist of things like loading bays, fire command centres, refuse stores, those kind of common areas that multiple people might need to access, whether it be tenants, retail unit operators, for example, or building management teams. So there might be facilities management offices, security control rooms, things like that as well, loading bays. And again, these will be accessed possibly from street level and then from various areas from within the building as well. And cycle stores are an area that we take into consideration much more often now. These can be as big or as small as the building requires, and is generally based on the occupancy. You might just have a cycle store, or there may also be associated changing facilities, dry wet rooms, shower facilities, etc. And again, these can be accessed possibly from street level, or you may access the building through somewhere like the loading bay before going through to a cycle store. And we need to think about how people get from the cycle store to their workspace, whether we want them to come back through a reception area, for example, and through that sort of control line, or whether there's a second control line that's put in at the rear of the building. And then we've got our reception or lobby space. And historically, this would have been an area that you go through a main set of doors, you go to a reception desk, you go through a bank's turnstiles, you get to the area that you're going to. And more these spaces are becoming kind of landing spaces. They might have seating areas, they might have chill out areas, coffee shops, as I say, access to different sections like retail. They can be, huge spaces with multiple reception desks, multiple check-in points, multiple banks of turnstiles. So the larger and the more complex these areas are, the more we need to think about from a security perspective how we're going to monitor them, how we're going to control the flow of people through them, how we're going to understand what's normal behaviour and what's not, and look at things like perhaps interior design and how we make sure that we don't create blind spots and things like that. So once we've understood the operational requirements for the building, how it's going to operate, the spaces that we've got within the site, the user groups and how they're going to move around the building, we need to think about the threats and risk posed to our business or the development. Now the threats need to be understood at a local level for the location of the building, understanding what's adjacent to it and what happens in the area generally, not only as today, but once this development's in place and any future developments and what that might look like in the future, but also for potential tenants and businesses that are going to operate here as well, and whether they might introduce some additional threats. We want to understand the most credible scenarios, the most credible threats that you need to think about in this particular location and development. And then we need to think about how those scenarios are going to manifest themselves within this particular development and where are we vulnerable. And then we can look at those risks and we can rate them. And then any risks that aren't acceptable, won't be tolerated, we can then look at the mitigation measures. And it's at that point that we would produce a security strategy. And it's that strategy that would determine or influence the security design and the security solution going forward. So as I say, once we've undertaken a security risk assessment and we understand what it is we're trying to protect against, what it is we're protecting, we can then think about risk mitigation. And some of the risks can be mitigated through layout and planning. And we can do this in a number of ways. Access points, understanding our access points and how we evacuate the building, making sure that those access points don't create additional risks or don't affect the building operationally by creating groups of people in an area, say in front of the bank of turnstiles, that give us clear line of sight from any checking points or desks or video surveillance that are going to be there, so we can see what's going on and who's coming into the site. Thinking about whether they're located near busy junctions outside the building and whether that's going to cause a problem, maybe increase criminal activity through things like theft and robbery. We want to look at visibility and ensuring that we keep some kind of element of natural surveillance outside the building. So not having really deep recessed doors that might be attractive to vagrants or drug dealing. As I said before, looking at perhaps maybe our back of house areas, not creating kind of alleyways and dark areas that could be attractive to certain types of crime. And within the space itself as well, visibility, making sure that whether we've got security officers on the ground or whether we're monitoring through video surveillance or a mixture of both, that we can clearly see the areas that we're trying to monitor. We spoke about our defined areas before, and we need to think about how we separate them to make sure that people within those areas that are allowed in those areas can't go further into the building, into unauthorised areas. If we use an example of a retail unit, perhaps they might have a storeroom or access to a refuse area, for example, further in the building. The location of that access point, how it's controlled and where it is located is really important, because it may be that a member of the public could quite easily walk through a door, let's say it's a fire exit that is used as an entry point to a goods store as well, with limited monitoring on it. A member of the public could potentially easily navigate their way through there without detection and move into a tenant's demise, for example. Storeroom perhaps is adjacent or within a tenant demise rather than in a more common area. So separation of these defined areas is really key in part of that early layout and planning phase. If we're going to have a security operations centre on site, where's that going to be located? How big does it need to be for ensuring that it meets the functionality criteria for the site? Is it going to be combined with a fire command centre, for example? How many operators is needed? How often is it going to be used? Is it 24/7? Making sure it's not located in an area that's vulnerable in its own right, so that it's not public facing. And for buildings where we do have public amenities, perhaps further in the building on higher floors, so there's a restaurant or some kind of publicly accessible gardens or something on higher levels, do we need to think about searching and screening? How are we going to incorporate that into that layout? Aesthetically, making sure that it meets the requirements of the look and feel of the building, whilst also meeting the functional requirements needed by security. So there need to be permanent measures. Do we perhaps need things for events that can be brought out as and when needed, and therefore where are they going to be stored? Do we have the correct power requirements? Things like that. Do we have perhaps a second entrance that is used to dedicate flow of people through to those areas, so that they're perhaps a little bit more functional and can have these elements without impacting another reception area? Secure by design may be a requirement, or maybe something that you're aiming to achieve. And secure by design principles, are good to apply even if you don't go through the process of getting accreditation. And these are things, like we said, creating good natural surveillance, considering the crime rates in the area and perhaps any impact rating that you might want to put on physical measures such as your doors and glazing, locations of glazing. Have we got glazed panels indoors? Is the glazing laminated? These kind of things that we can consider. And do we need to think about counter-terrorism? Counter-terrorism may or may not be something that needs to be considered in that location. The risk assessment will determine that. Things like hostile vehicle mitigation measures, perhaps for entrances to loading bays and car parks. Can we achieve anything through integrated design and landscaping, rather than having to have, perhaps bollards? Is there a way that this can be integrated to be more of an architectural element? With much more options if we do this early on in the process, so we can coordinate with services such as civils and architectural landscape design. And then at what stage do we need to think about counterterrorism? Well, counterterrorism really needs to be thought about in the early stages, as I said, purely because it gives you more options for design. There may be planning constraints around some of these measures because they're physically visible. And something that's coming into effect in the next 12 to 18 months is called the Duty Protect. This is a new piece of legislation that was born out of Martin's Law, which is a campaign started by Fegan Murray, who was the mother of somebody that unfortunately lost their life during the Manchester Arena attack. And following later terrorist attacks in London, she started to campaign for a change in legislation, or to create a legislation that meant that counterterrorism needed to be considered. And what this legislation is going to do is to introduce the requirement to understand your threat and risk and where you're vulnerable, and to put practicable measures in place to mitigate, but also to understand how you'll respond to measures and ensure that staff are trained in how to respond, so that can be done as efficiently as possible. We're going to be holding a webinar on this, which will be advertised later on in this webinar, which if you're interested, please do come along and we'll provide a little bit more information about how that might impact you and how you can prepare for that. So if we look at technology in a little bit more detail now, we've spoken about some of the physical measures that need to be considered and the layout and planning elements. And then we've got technology, which is evolving all the time, especially within the security world. So if we look at access control, there are now options for things like mobile phone credentials, the person being the credentials, so that might be through biometrics or facial recognition, for example, which mean we don't need cards, physical cards anymore. Integrated and seamless visitor management, so we can have self-check-in kiosks. Again, mobile phones can be used for instructions as the credential for coming in, as the way of checking in as well. These can be check-in kiosks, perhaps. There's lots of options out there now, and the visitor management can be integrated with access control as well now, so it gives us a really good picture of everybody in the building, not just our day-to-day staff. ANPR can be valuable in car parks, for example, or perhaps in loading bays. You know, when designed and fitted in accordance with manufacturer's instructions, this can be a good way of managing flow into your car parks. And there's also lots of options for the integration of access control into other building management solutions, such as room booking, lift destination, which we'll speak a little bit more later on in this presentation, time and attendance, intercoms. There are actually readers now that can be the intercom as well. Instructional signage and advertisement can be linked to readers as well now, so perhaps on your turnstiles it might tell you which lift bank to go to, or there might be some instructional signage for directions or advertisement on that reader, sound and out of hours door, for example. Security and health and safety checks. So again, it's possible to link up with these different databases, and it may be that in some of perhaps a back of house area that hasn't got such a regular flow of people, and it might not be controlled by a security officer, it might be that you want to ensure that somebody going into that particular area has the appropriate authority from health and safety to do so, have undertaken a particular induction, for example. And we can link into these systems and access control to manage that. We can also, there's options for emergency muster and roll call on handheld devices as well as more static devices. So there's lots of options out there now for integration with access control. So really understanding your operational requirements and what you need to effectively operate these buildings in the early stages is key, because it then gives you the option to look at performance and functional requirements of the systems that you're putting in, and what systems are out there to give you the best functionality for what you want. Video surveillance is another area that is developing all the time. Analytics has been around for a long time. They get better year on year. So if we look at video surveillance through analytics, this can then be used as an active security solution, which means we can generate alarms based on specific scenarios. So it might mean that we can reduce the number of people in the area or that monitor, but rather than it be about reduction of people, we can more effectively use those people where we need them. And where we've got really large multi-use areas in buildings, this can be particularly beneficial. And some of the areas that we can look at are things like loitering and intrusion, idle or removed objects, facial recognition, and in this context we talk about perhaps a known perpetrator entering the site that's detected through facial recognition cameras. And then through machine learning, you can work with analytics to detect unusual behaviour. So that the area, there will be a normal pattern of behaviour in that area, and when there's a change to that, it can alert security, which can be really valuable. And it allows security to do their job efficiently, respond not only quickly, but with the relevant information that they need to do that effectively and with the right workflows. And we can also use video analytics for non-security reasons, I guess we can call it. And if we're putting video in anyway, and we're using analytics for this particular site, then it's always worth considering some of the other functions that you might be able to achieve through this, which can help with your investment, but also looking at future builds as well. And we can do things like people counting, retail hotspots, queue length and abandonment, and people traffic routes. And as I said, these are valuable not only to look at your building as it is today and how it's being, if it's being run effectively or not, on making any changes to make it more effective, but this is data that can then be used to look at future developments and what's done well and not well in a particular site and how that might be improved at future developments. So with all of these measures we've spoken about, we've got physical, technical, and we've spoken about some operational elements of security, which gives us a good holistic security solution. But if we don't monitor and respond well, then it's almost pointless putting some of these things in. So if we think about monitoring and response and how this might be done, there are a number of ways of doing this, and not every solution fits every site. So you could do this on site. You could have a security control room on site that actively monitor systems and respond on site. Or there could be an off-site alarm receiving centre that does this for you. Or there could be a mixture of both. It may be that during working hours you do one and out of hours you do another. Or you've got an intrusion detection system that's set out of hours and there's a key holding service that responds to those. There are different options out there depending on how quickly you need to be able to respond to events and the complexities of the buildings that you're running. And through security management systems, we can have really valuable single user interfaces that teams can use to be able to undertake effective real-time monitoring of these systems. So through linking the security systems such as video management and access control through one of these management systems, you can have a simpler solution as a single alarm screen, but it can be as enhanced as you want it to be. And it could be that you have some maps of your building or sites with some active icons, for example, so that you can unlock a door from a floor plan. Or if you get a door alarm come up, the video not only pops up on the screen for that door, but it perhaps shows you 10 seconds beforehand so you can see what happened for that alarm to be generated. And again, all of these measures allow effective monitoring and effective response, and quicker response, can quite often really reduce the impact of some of these things. It also helps with things like reduction of training of personnel because we've got more kind of work process-based stuff in place. So that can be valuable and a cost saving there as well. And we've also get really good audit trails. So if there is an incident post-investigation, we need to have a look at what happened and who did what. Then these systems in this way give you a really good audit trail of what that was. We can also integrate the security systems with other building management systems through security management interfaces, and that could be with building management, lighting, for example, asset tracking, just to name a few there. And again, this can mean that you can have a really good coordinated approach to the monitoring and management of your buildings. And a really important point that I just want to touch on here, response plans and trainings are really valuable and really key, because if you don't understand how you're going to respond to security incidents and the different types of incidents, and that includes response on the ground, escalation of any issues, perhaps that incident management tiered approach that you might have, communication plans, call trees, whatever that might involve, understanding how you're going to respond to the different incidents and making sure that the relevant staff are then trained in how to do that regularly and that these are reviewed regularly will mean that you are more likely to have the response that you want. You are more likely to reduce the impact of your incidents, and you are going to provide staff with the to be more empowered, to have confidence in the way that they do things. And it's in the same way that we health and safety train staff in how to evacuate a building during a fire alarm. We practice that, it's well practiced. It's the same concept for security incidents as well. And in summary, really, I just want to kind of highlight what we've said earlier in the presentation, that, you know, the key to security is to engage early. Security is often seen as a blocker, and that's not what it should be at all. One of the main objectives of a good security solution is to ensure that the building does operate effectively and efficiently, whilst protecting the assets within that have been identified from the threats. And in order to do this and to give you the most options out there, the earlier we engage, the more efficient we can do that process, and the more, as I say, the more options there are and the more cost effective it becomes. We can make sure by doing it in this way that you have not only the most proportionate and appropriate solution, but that you hopefully then don't have to rip out and replace later on because it wasn't thought through in the early stages. And on that note, I'd like to hand over to my colleague Graham. Thank you.
Thanks, Lee. The traditional visitor experience is not very slick, not efficient for visitors, and requires a number of operational staff along the way. You receive an invite to a meeting with a time and a place, not a lot else. You report to the reception desk, explain why you've come to the building today and who you're here to meet. They'll sign you in, check your credentials, and often provide you with a badge. Perhaps they'll take your photo for the badge. The security staff will then pass you through the turnstiles, and in many cases they'll also select the destination floor on the lift or tell you which button to press. You travel in the lift to your destination floor and report to the tenants reception, where again you explain why you're in the building today, who you've come to see. That receptionist contacts your host to make them aware that you've arrived, and after a short wait you'll have your meeting. Through integration of these systems, this can be made much better. So let's look at what a slick, modern visitor experience can look like. You receive a meeting invite, but this is much more than an invite, and it will allow you to use your phone to access the building. You can advise your preferences for parking or any accessibility needs. You can provide in advance your identification credentials. You might even advise how you like your coffee. You then use your phone to go through the turnstiles. On arrival, you pass by the reception desk, head straight for the turnstiles, and present the graphic on your phone to the turnstile reader. The turnstile opens and the lift is called for you, and you're informed which lift to take. The lift knows where you're going, and at the same time the visitor management system notifies your invitee of your arrival at the building and that you're currently on your way to meet them. And you arrive at the tenant's floor, your tenant's aware of your arrival. There's no need to report to another reception in the tenant's floor, and you can have your meeting. A much slicker process than the 10-step process that we saw earlier. So let's look at what's happening behind the scenes. There are 4 independent systems all integrating and operating together to deliver this experience. The physical systems of the lifts and the turnstiles are integrated with the access control and visitor management systems. Before we arrived at the building, the visitor management system was preparing the access control system for arrival. Our invite contained a web link to a web interface on the visitor management system, where we provided our information in advance of attending the meeting, our credentials, our identification, maybe how we liked our coffee. If we're a regular visitor, those credentials may be stored within the system to further ease our experience, all in line with GDPR. The visitor management system provides us with a secure code which we can present to the reader at the turnstile to gain access. When swiped, the details are conveyed to the access control system to check the permission of the swipe from our phone. This also offers the opportunity for our access rights to only be valid on a particular date or time. Perhaps our meeting's at 10 o'clock and our credentials become live from 9 o'clock, for example. The access control system checks that our swipe details are valid, and assuming that they are, then it informs the turnstile gate to open and the lift controller to provide a lift to take us to our destination, at the same time informing the lift system what our destination is. Milliseconds later, the lift controller provides the information of which lift we should take and displays this on the indicator at the turnstile. The lift arrives and takes us to our floor for our meeting, where our host is waiting. In larger buildings, we have further integrated this with wayfinding systems to aid the visitor in their journey from the reception to the lifts, or from the lifts to the destination meeting room. This type of integration happens most effectively when it's thought about at the outset of a building's design. If not thought about at base build, it's unlikely to be commercially viable unless you're doing a full building refurbishment. The lift system needs to be able to work in a way to allow integration. Lift destination control is needed for full integration. Changing an existing non-destination control lift system to destination control is possible, but expensive and requires extensive work. Developers and designers should define their desires for smart integration before any contracts are awarded. We need to think about how systems, and more importantly, the visitor and this type of integration happens most effectively when it's thought about at the outset of a building's design. If it's not thought about at base build, then it's unlikely to be commercially viable unless you're doing a full building refurbishment. The lift system needs to be able to work in a way to allow integration. Lift destination control is needed for full integration, and changing an existing non-destination control lift system to destination control, whilst possible, is very expensive and very involved. Developers and designers should define their desires for smart integration before any contracts are awarded. We also need to think less about systems and more about the visitor experience, and then couple the right systems together to achieve this. The key to all of this working is compatibility between systems so that they can communicate. Not all systems can. The access control system is often the issue and may need to be replaced if it's not suitable for integration to the lifts or the visitor management system. If an integration doesn't already exist off the shelf between the lifts and the access control system, it's likely to cost in the region of £50,000 to develop and might not be possible. Some access controls also can't react quickly enough for the millisecond timings that are required to facilitate this journey. They can integrate, but the operational time is just too slow, and no one wants to be waiting for the turnstile bit to be open because the smart systems are still thinking. If this level of integration is envisaged for your building, then the base build specification should incorporate the potential for integration, even if the capital equipment isn't fully installed. Recognise that this integration does not come cheap, but there are additional costs in design. Recognise that this integration does not come cheap, that there are additional costs in design, capital cost and installation, but attempting to retrofit a building not designed in this way is much more costly. Don't commit to provide it unless you understand what the full commitment is. Now, with that, I'll pass over to Rory, who's going to explain how this is really just the tip of the iceberg for smart, and that the future offers so much more.
Thanks, Graham. So to summarise, the capabilities of traditional building systems like access control and lift management systems are expanding. Adding applications like visitor management systems can solve specific pain points in operation, and the more intelligently these systems integrate and share data, the better the outcomes. But maybe we can achieve more. Maybe we can provide an even better user experience without increasing the human effort to manage. Maybe we can free up human resources to provide opportunities currently constrained by operational budgets. The term smart has become as ubiquitous as it is vague, and this isn't a smart building webinar, so let's define smart by what it does rather than what it is. Our high-level view of the process begins with sensing, and this is data collection from the existing building systems, additional sensors and human inputs. We then store or reference that data to make it accessible and not siloed in isolated systems. Using analytics, data becomes information and is shared where relevant, and through interventions we directly enable something to happen by another system, or by telling an analog interface like a human to do something. When we monitor the outcomes, we close the loop to establish if the outcomes were actually beneficial. So where should we apply SMART? Well, everywhere, but today we're focusing on two areas: the experience for the visitor and efficiency for the operator. Implementing SMART is about solving pain points, and common example is queuing. My colleagues have already discussed how visitors can be pre-authenticated through visitor management and access control systems, but in a mixed-use reception, not every queue will be for accessing the office floors. Returning to our ground floor space, we can consider the benefit of a smart platform that combines the data collected via occupancy sensors, mobile app authentication, in addition to the CCTV analytics. From a building operator perspective, there are a number of benefits. Knowing the actual number of people in the public realm space to ensure safe occupancy and that they're adhering to fire strategy regulations. Occupancy sensors in the lifts so that we know the true occupancy rather than estimated by load weight, and same lift lobby occupancy so that lifts are better targeted over time. This also enables things like rerouting people to avoid incidents, and also, more importantly, we can differentiate between visitors to the offices and those in the public realm and see how it's being used. The future may well be a single building operating system, but single complex systems require evolution, and the commercial environment is not the place to develop them. Building life safety systems undergo rigorous proving before implementation, so connecting smart building software must be implemented without impairing those processes. We believe SMART is a beneficial augmentation, but one that does not cause building paralysis should it fail. The traditional building system should carry on regardless. In many ways, if you operate a building, you might already have some idea of where the efficiencies lie. If you're a tenant, perhaps you're wondering why it's easier to check into a hotel than it is to enter your office building. So the answer to how smart should I make my building is very much a balancing act, even broader than the items that we've shown here. As we continue to develop a better experience for every visitor to a building, we also solve many of the pain points building operators experience. Cundall have delivered a number of smart building projects, and we are finding many developers see SMART as a way to keep their building relevant and future fit. So how are Cundall delivering this? Unfortunately, smart building projects have a propensity to attract NDAs. However, Graham is going to share some of our lessons learned that have led to successful projects.
Thanks, Rory. Some of our learnings from current and past projects provide us with several key learnings. Prepare, visualize how the building will be used when construction, who will use it, how they will access it, how they will move around, and what else is around the building which may impact upon them and it. Understand use, engage with potential tenants to understand market desires. Aside from the smooth visitor experience, the idea of a contactless entry system in a building is attractive to many currently. Future planning and proofing. Understand where market needs are going. Can you incorporate elements into the design of your building which facilitates tenant desires or at least doesn't block them? Lift destination control is a good example here. Design in. In many cases it's possible to allow for the integration at the design stage without physically installing it, but making sure that the installed base build equipment allows for future addition of features. The key to all of this is the access control system and lift system having the ability to integrate. Define the outputs or experience. What will make this building stand out to potential tenants? What does the market want and how can building designers enable it? Operational knowledge. One of the real benefits of SMART is the knock-on effect one building can have on the next. Through the use of analytics, we can truly understand how our buildings are used and then design the next building using that real-life data. Buy it right, buy it once. In so many projects, we see wastage of time or capital because these things weren't considered early enough. In some cases, the developer has installed great integration, but the tenant doesn't actually want it, so it's just wasted. Or in others, the tenant wants something that the building just can't provide. So, as we come towards the close, I'd like to thank you for joining us today. And signpost you to our YouTube channel where you'll see a number of other webinars that we've presented, and also to highlight a couple of upcoming webinars. So we've got Andrew Bissell, our lighting director, will be talking about the Dark Skies project. Lee Harper, who joined us today, will be with her colleague Luke Stevens to talk about Martin's Law, which has been developed following the Manchester Arena bombings, and that will place requirements on businesses, venues and events to consider anti-terrorism. And Simon Wyatt, our sustainability partner, will talk about the upcoming challenges of COP26 in November this year. So with that, thanks very much for joining us today. I hope you enjoyed our webinar.